Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. There are places in Middle-earth where memory itself has been buried, where the wind does not whisper of valor or glory, but carries only silence, a silence thick with the weight of forgotten blood. Far to the south, beyond the reach of most songs, beyond the concern of most chronicles, lie battlefields that time has swallowed whole. The shifting dunes of the Harad Waith do not remember. The crimson sands do not speak. Yet beneath them, entombed in layers of dust and centuries, rest the bones of thousands, warriors of Gondor and Harad alike, locked in an embrace of enmity that outlasted their very civilizations. These are not the battles sung in the halls of Minas Tirith. These are not the wars that bards recount when they speak of Gondor's glory. For when men recall the great conflicts of the South Kingdom, their minds turn always to Mordor, to the shadow of Barad-dûr, to the terror of the Nazgûl, to the final desperate stand at the Black Gate. Yet there was another enemy, an older enemy, an enemy whose hatred burned not with the cold malice of Sauron, but with the fierce pride of free kingdoms resisting what they saw as invasion, colonization, the slow stranglehold of northern imperialism. The warriors of Harad were no mindless servants of darkness. They were sons and daughters of blazing suns and ancient dynasties. They rode across deserts that would kill a Gondorian soldier in days. They forged civilizations in lands where water was worth more than gold. And when Gondor's white banners came south, when the armored might of Númenórean blood marched into territories the Haradrim considered their own, hatred took root. A hatred that would endure for thousands of years. Imagine, if you will, a rusted helm emerging from beneath the sand. The metal pitted and scarred, the white paint long since scoured away by endless storms. A relic from an age when Gondor was young and proud and hungry for dominion. The desert reclaims all things eventually, armor, bone, memory. Yet sometimes, when the wind shifts in a certain way, when storms reshape the dunes into patterns not seen for centuries, these remnants surface. Brief, transient, a momentary testament that something terrible happened here, that blood soaked into this earth in quantities that stained it red, that this was a place where kingdoms clashed and neither truly won. And so the question rises, carried on that same wind. What battles were these? What wars consumed so many lives yet left so few records? What conflicts raged across the Southlands while Gondor's gaze remained fixed upon Mordor's shadow? The answers lie not in grand histories, but in fragments, in torn parchments, in the faded memories of a fading realm. And the tale they tell is one of pride meeting pride, of empire colliding with defiance, of a war that lasted not decades but centuries, a slow, grinding conflict that bled both nations white and left scars that never truly healed. The desert remembers, even if men do not. And buried in those crimson sands, a forgotten war cries out to be remembered. Deep within the archives of Minas Tirith, in chambers where few are permitted to tread, rest the scrolls of the stewards. These are not the public records, not the carefully curated histories meant for scholars and historians. These are the private chronicles, the unvarnished accounts kept by those who ruled Gondor in the absence of kings. Accounts written in times of desperation, recording truths too bitter for public consumption. And among these scrolls, scattered throughout centuries of careful script, appear references to conflicts in the South, brief mentions, terse reports, casualty lists that seem impossibly long, records of expeditions that departed with fanfare and returned in shameful silence. The stewards knew what the songs did not sing. They understood that Gondor's borders were not threatened solely by Mordor's shadow. For while Sauron's malice was terrible and his armies vast, there existed another frontier, vast, hostile, and endlessly turbulent. The southern marches, the territories bordering the Harad, the coastlines vulnerable to corsair raids. These were the lands that bled Gondor's strength year after year, generation after generation, in conflicts that never achieved resolution because neither side possessed the strength to deliver a final blow. Consider the maps preserved in those same archives. Faded parchments depicting Gondor at its height, when the realm of Elendil's sons stretched far beyond what later ages would know. Borders that pushed deep into southern territories, encompassing regions with names now lost to all but the most dedicated scholars. Umbar, yes, that great haven is remembered, though its history is tangled and dark. But what of the other outposts? The fortress cities established to secure trade routes through desert lands. The settlements meant to bring Gondorian law and order to peoples who neither wanted nor welcomed such gifts. These maps tell a story of ambition, of a young realm, powerful and confident, extending its reach southward as naturally as a plant grows towards sunlight. The kingdoms of Harad were fragmented then, divided into countless tribes and dynasties, each jealous of its neighbors, each suspicious of foreign powers. Gondor's early stewards, or rather, the kings who preceded them, saw opportunity in this division. Alliances could be forged, trade agreements negotiated, and where diplomacy failed, military force could succeed. After all, what were scattered desert tribes against the disciplined might of Númenórean arms? Yet the scrolls record something else as well. A growing unease in the reports sent northward from those southern outposts. Mentions of coordinated resistance, references to unexpected unity among previously hostile factions. Casualty reports that increased steadily, year by year, as Gondor's presence in the south became not merely unwelcome but actively contested. The early confidence gives way to concern, then to alarm, then to grim determination. The language shifts from the triumphant prose of expansion to the terse military reporting of commanders who no longer expect easy victories. One scroll in particular draws the eye of any who examine these records carefully. It describes what the author terms the First Great Southern Rising, a coordinated assault upon Gondorian positions throughout the Harad, orchestrated with a level of strategic sophistication that shocked the northern commanders. Outposts that had stood for decades fell in coordinated night attacks. Supply caravans vanished without trace. Entire companies of soldiers disappeared into the desert, with only their armor later found, half buried in the sand, bodies taken by scavengers or simply swallowed by the shifting dunes. The account is detailed, methodical, describing the desperate attempts to reinforce besieged positions, the appeals sent north for additional troops, the growing realization that Gondor had overextended itself badly and now faced an enemy that fought with the desert itself as an ally. The Haradrim knew the land. They knew where water could be found and where it could not. They knew when storms would strike and how to shelter from them. They knew which routes could support an army and which would lead only to slow death beneath an merciless sun. And then Frustratingly, the account ends. Mid-sentence, the parchment torn, or perhaps the scroll itself incomplete, with the remainder lost to time, fire, or deliberate destruction. We are left with questions that the stewards themselves may never have answered. Did Gondor survive this first great rising? Obviously, yes, for the realm endured. But at what cost? How many soldiers died in those southern wastes? How much territory was abandoned? How many fortresses were razed and never rebuilt? The silence that follows that torn parchment is itself a kind of answer. Some defeats are too bitter to record fully, some truths too painful to preserve. To understand the depth of the conflict, one must return to earlier days, to the time when Gondor was not yet a declining power clinging to past glories, but a young and vigorous realm, confident in its strength and destiny. In those days, the armies of the South Kingdom marched with the certainty of inevitable victory. They wore armor forged in techniques passed down from Númenor itself, carried swords of steel that could cleave through lesser weapons like axes through kindling, and fought with the discipline of soldiers who had never known defeat. When these armies turned southward, they did so with clear objectives. The lands of Harad were rich, not in the manner of Gondor's fertile fields, but in different ways. Spices and exotic goods flowed through southern trade routes. Mineral wealth lay buried in regions where Gondor's influence did not yet reach. And strategically, control of the southern approaches would secure Gondor's flank against any potential alliance between the desert kingdoms and the ancient enemy in Mordor. Picture, then, the early marches. Columns of armored soldiers moving in perfect formation across terrain that seemed hostile to all life. The white banners of Gondor streaming in hot winds that offered no relief from the punishing sun. Officers consulting maps that showed oases and settlements that sometimes existed and sometimes did not, for the desert was treacherous, and landmarks shifted with the dunes. Yet still they marched, these sons of Westerness, carrying with them the absolute conviction that their cause was righteous and their victory assured. The first encounters were almost incidental. Skirmishes with raiding parties, brief exchanges of arrows with scouts who vanished into shimmering heat before pursuit could be organized. Gondorian commanders wrote these off as minor nuisances, the predictable friction of expansion into new territories. After all, what true threat could nomadic tribesmen pose to disciplined infantry supported by cavalry and supplied by long logistical chains stretching back to the great cities of the north? But the Haradrim were watching. From the high places of the desert, from camps hidden in valleys and canyons that Gondorian maps did not show, they observed the foreign armies with keen interest. They noted the routes the invaders preferred, the times they made camp, the weaknesses in their formations. And most importantly, they began to talk to one another, tribes that had been enemies for generations, dynasties that had feuded over water rights and grazing lands, all began to recognize a common threat. Gondor's presence grew heavier. Outposts became fortresses. Fortresses became administrative centers. Trade agreements negotiated at sword point generated resentment that festered like infected wounds. Local customs were overridden by Gondorian law. Disputes were settled by northern magistrates who understood nothing of desert traditions. And slowly, inexorably, the scattered peoples of Harad began to unify in opposition. The turning point came at an outpost whose name has been lost to time, erased from maps when it fell, stricken from records in shame. It was not a large fortress by Gondorian standards. Perhaps 200 soldiers garrisoned there, along with administrators, merchants, and the families of officers who had made the South their home. It stood at a strategic crossroads, controlling access to an important oasis and the trade routes that converged there. One night under a moonless sky, it simply vanished. Not destroyed, that would have left ruins, evidence of battle, some indication of what had occurred. But when the next supply caravan arrived 3 weeks later, they found nothing. The fortress stood empty. Gates open. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Supplies remained in the storerooms. Weapons still hung in the armory. But of the 200 souls who had garrisoned that place, there was no trace whatsoever. The soldiers of the supply caravan searched frantically. They examined every building, every room, calling out names that echoed unanswered through empty corridors. They found meals half-eaten on tables, as though the diners had simply stood and walked away mid-bite. They found children's toys scattered in courtyards where youngsters had played. They found everything except the people themselves. And in the center of the fortress courtyard, they found a single banner planted in the sand. Not Gondor's white tree, but a serpent coiled upon a field of crimson, a symbol none of them recognized, yet one that filled them with inexplicable dread. The fortress was never reoccupied. Gondorian command deemed it cursed, or tainted, or simply too dangerous to hold. But the message had been sent, clear as the desert sun. Harad would not be conquered easily. The war had truly begun. History would come to know it as the War of the Red Serpent, though that name was applied only in retrospect, in the chronicles written decades after the conflict had finally, exhaustedly concluded. At the time, Gondorian commanders had no single name for what they faced, only a growing awareness that they confronted not a disorganized resistance, but a coordinated military campaign orchestrated by a mind of considerable genius. The ruler who united the scattered Haradrim tribes beneath that crimson serpent banner remains a figure of mystery. Gondorian records refer to him variously as the Desert King, the Serpent Lord, or simply the Enemy, as though speaking his name might grant him power. What little we know suggests a man of extraordinary charisma and tactical brilliance, capable of forging alliances between peoples who had spent centuries at one another's throats. Whether he was a warlord who seized power through strength of arms, or a priest-king chosen by ancient prophecy, or simply the right leader emerging at the right moment when his people needed him most desperately, this we cannot say with certainty. What we do know is the terror his campaigns unleashed. The war began not with great battles, but with a campaign of systematic annihilation against Gondor's isolated outposts. Small fortresses, trading posts, way station along the southern roads, all came under coordinated assault. The Haradrim attacked at night, emerging from the desert like vengeful spirits. They struck with overwhelming force, accepted no surrenders, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Within a single year, Gondor's presence in the deep south was effectively erased. The kingdom responded as kingdoms do, with military force. Armies were raised, provisioned, and dispatched southward with orders to restore Gondorian authority and punish those responsible for the attacks. These were not small raiding parties, but proper military expeditions. Thousands of infantry, companies of cavalry, siege equipment to reduce any fortifications the enemy might shelter behind, and supplies meant to sustain extended campaigns. They marched into a nightmare. The Haradrim did not meet them in open battle, not at first. Instead, they employed tactics that Gondorian military doctrine had no answer for. Supply lines were cut by fast-moving raiders who struck and scattered before pursuit could be organized. Water sources were poisoned or deliberately fouled. Wells were filled with sand overnight, springs blocked with stones. The desert itself became a weapon, wielded with cruel precision by an enemy who understood it intimately. Gondorian soldiers began dying not from enemy arrows, but from thirst, from heat exhaustion, from fevers contracted in the punishing conditions. They marched in full armor beneath a sun that turned metal into implements of torture, following guides who sometimes led them true, and sometimes led them into box canyons where Haradrim archers waited on the high cliffs. Officers who had trained in the military academies of Minas Tirith found their educations worthless here. What good was knowledge of siege warfare when the enemy refused to be besieged? What value had cavalry tactics when every charge across desert sand ended with horses collapsing from exhaustion? Yet the Haradrim were not invincible, and they could not avoid battle forever. When Gondorian forces finally succeeded in bringing them to engagement, usually by threatening something the Southerners could not afford to lose, an oasis town or a sacred site, the fighting was ferocious beyond anything recorded in earlier wars. Picture a battle in a narrow canyon, where the sun turns stone into furnaces, and the air itself seems to burn in the lungs. Gondorian infantry formed their traditional shield walls, overlapping protection that had broken enemy charges for centuries. But the Haradrim did not charge. Instead, they rained arrows from the canyon walls, each shaft finding gaps in armor, throats above shield rims, the exposed legs of soldiers whose armor did not extend to full greaves. When the Gondorians broke formation to pursue their tormentors up the canyon slopes, the Haradrim melted away, only to reappear behind the disordered infantry, cutting them off from retreat. The battle devolved into a desperate melee, discipline shattered, each soldier fighting for survival rather than victory. By the time the sun set, painting the canyon walls the color of blood, more than half the Gondorian force lay dead or dying. The survivors retreated northward, harassed every step of the way by mounted Haradrim who followed like wolves trailing wounded prey. The war ground on. Seasons passed. Years accumulated. Gondor poured resources into the conflict that might have been spent strengthening defenses against Mordor or supporting the northern provinces. The Haradrim suffered terribly as well, their populations decimated, their lands ravaged, entire tribes reduced to scattered refugees. Yet neither side could deliver a decisive blow. Gondor could not pacify the desert. Harad could not drive the northerners entirely from southern territories. And then, just when it seemed the war might exhaust both civilizations into collapse, Gondor achieved what its commanders thought was a breakthrough. A major Haradrim army was caught in the open, far from the safety of the deep desert, and destroyed in a conventional battle that favored Gondorian tactics. The Red Serpent's forces broke and fled. Prisoners were taken, the first time in the entire war that Haradrim warriors had surrendered in significant numbers. Intelligence gleaned from interrogations suggested the enemy's network of alliances was fracturing, that tribes were abandoning the Serpent Lord's cause. Celebration erupted in Minas Tirith. Messengers carried news of the great victory throughout Gondor. Church bells rang. Wine flowed freely in the streets. The Southern War was over, or soon would be. The Desert King was defeated, his armies scattered, his cause broken. The celebration lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, a messenger rode into the city. His horse died beneath him as he reached the gates, heart burst from the desperate ride northward. The man himself collapsed before he could deliver his report verbally, but the dispatch he carried told the tale clearly enough. The red serpent banner had risen again. Not in one place, but in dozens. Every outpost, every fortress, every Gondorian position south of a certain line had come under simultaneous assault. And leading the attacks were Haradrim armies that seemed larger, better equipped, and more coordinated than any previously encountered. The battle Gondor had won was not the war's ending, but a feint, a deliberate sacrifice meant to draw Gondorian forces into a false sense of security while the true hammer blow was prepared. Now that hammer fell, and the South Kingdom reeled from the impact. The war was not over. In truth, it had barely begun. While land campaigns consumed the attention of most commanders, another theater of war raged across the waves, one focused upon the ancient haven of Umbar and its shadowed harbors. This struggle combined naval warfare, political intrigue, and a bitterness born from histories older than the conflict itself. Umbar had never been a simple place, never belonged wholly to any single power. In the distant past, Númenóreans had founded it as a great haven, a jewel of their civilization in Middle-earth. But when Númenor fell and the kingdoms in exile were established, Umbar became a refuge for the king's men, those who had rejected the valor, who had followed Sauron in their pride, and who now hated the faithful of Gondor with the special venom reserved for ideological kin who chose differently. These black Númenóreans transformed Umbar into a center of maritime power that rivaled Gondor's own fleets. Their ships prowled the coasts like predatory fish, raiding Gondorian settlements, disrupting trade, and establishing the haven as an independent power answering to no authority save its own. And when the Desert King sought allies in his war against the North, Umbar's rulers saw opportunity. The alliance was natural, almost inevitable. Both harbored ancient grievances against Gondor. Both possessed military strengths that complemented the other, Harad's armies and Umbar's fleets. Together, they could threaten Gondor from two directions simultaneously, forcing the South Kingdom to divide its forces and defend a coastline spanning hundreds of miles. The naval war that erupted was unlike anything Gondor had faced before. Umbar's corsairs were not pirates engaging in random raiding, but a coordinated naval force executing sophisticated strategy. They struck not at random targets, but at carefully chosen ones. Ports crucial to Gondor's southern supply lines, fishing villages that fed coastal cities, merchant hubs where goods from inland trade routes met seagoing vessels. Night became the corsairs' domain. Under cover of darkness, their ships would appear off a coastal settlement without warning, black sails invisible against the night sky until they were almost upon their targets. Fire arrows would arc through the darkness, setting roofs ablaze and turning night into flickering orange chaos. Raiders would pour ashore, seizing supplies and captives before vanishing back into the darkness, before Gondorian military forces could respond. Gondor's navy attempted to counter these raids through patrols and blockades. Warships were stationed at key points along the coast, maintaining watches throughout the night, ready to intercept corsair vessels. But Umbar's captains were masters of their craft, navigating by stars and currents, finding passages through dangerous waters that Gondorian ships dared not attempt. They knew every hidden cove and sheltered inlet, every approach that avoided the patrol routes. When Gondorian ships did manage to engage them, the battles were savage. Ships closed to boarding range, and combat spilled across both decks in a tangle of blades and blood. Gondorian marines fought with disciplined precision, but corsairs battled with desperate ferocity, knowing capture meant execution as pirates rather than treatment as prisoners of war. Ships grappled together would burn or sink, dragging crews from both sides down into dark waters. The harbor at Umbar itself became a primary objective. If Gondor could seize the haven, the corsair threat would be ended at its source. Multiple expeditions were launched to accomplish precisely this. Great fleets carrying armies meant to besiege and capture the city. Each attempt met with failure, though the reasons varied. The first expedition was destroyed by a storm. Whether natural or called by sorceries, accounts differ. The fleet was scattered, ships driven onto rocks or simply swallowed by waves that towered higher than their masts. Fewer than half the vessels returned to Gondorian ports. The second expedition reached Umbar and established a beachhead, beginning siege operations against the city's formidable walls. But Haradrim armies appeared from the inland deserts, cutting the besiegers off from their supplies and placing them in a desperate position. The expedition's commander, faced with the prospect of being trapped between Umbar's defenders and the approaching Haradrim host, ordered retreat. The evacuation was costly, conducted under constant attack, and deemed a shameful failure. The third expedition seemed, initially, more successful. Through a combination of assault and negotiation, Gondorian forces managed to enter Umbar itself. For a brief period, months only, the white tree banner flew above the haven's towers. But holding Umbar proved far more difficult than capturing it. The population was hostile. The black Númenorian elite fled, but did not surrender, and maintaining supply lines to a city hundreds of miles from Gondor's heartland proved logistically impossible. When the inevitable counterattack came, corsairs and Haradrim forces acting in concert, the Gondorian garrison was overwhelmed. Few escaped the city alive. These failures took a toll beyond mere military losses. Each expedition represented an enormous expenditure of resources, both material and human. Ships took years to build, and experienced sailors could not be quickly replaced. The repeated setbacks at Umbar damaged Gondor's prestige and emboldened its enemies. And perhaps most damagingly, they created the perception that Umbar was unconquerable, that any effort to eliminate the corsair threat was doomed to failure. It was during this period of naval warfare that intelligence reached Gondor's admirals, which fundamentally altered their understanding of the strategic situation. A captured corsair captain, facing execution, offered information in exchange for his life. What he revealed chilled the blood of those who heard it. The alliance between Umbar and Harad was not merely one of convenience. It was deeper, darker, cemented by bonds that reached back to Mordor itself. Sauron's agents had been active in both Umbar and the Haradrim kingdoms for decades, offering gifts of weapons and knowledge, whispering promises of power, carefully nurturing the hatred both peoples felt toward Gondor. The entire Southern Coalition was not simply a regional conflict, but part of a larger design, a scheme to weaken and ultimately destroy the greatest kingdom of men standing against the Dark Lord's domination. The corsair captain described emissaries cloaked in black who spoke with voices that seemed to bypass the ear and resonate directly in the mind. He told of gifts brought from Mordor, Weapons that never dulled, poisons that killed with agonizing certainty, and knowledge of dark arts that could turn storms to serve strategic purposes. And he spoke of promises, that when Gondor finally fell, those who had served the Dark Lord faithfully would be rewarded with dominion over the ruins. The interrogators asked whether he believed these promises. The corsair laughed, a bitter, hopeless sound. "Believe them," he said. "No, but what choice remains? Gondor would see us all hanged as pirates. Mordor offers at least a chance at survival, even if that survival means becoming servants of darkness. A man dying of thirst in the desert does not refuse water because the taste is foul." His life was spared, though he was never freed. He died years later, still imprisoned, having provided intelligence that reshaped Gondor's entire understanding of the Southern War. The conflict was not, and had never been, simply a struggle over territory or trade. It was part of a vast web of manipulation spun by a mind of timeless malice, turning legitimate grievances and ancient hatreds into weapons against the last free kingdoms of men. To speak of Harad as a single entity is to misunderstand the fundamental nature of that vast southern realm. The Haradwaith was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of cultures, dynasties, and power structures as diverse as the lands they ruled. From the scorching sands of the deep desert to the somewhat more hospitable coastal regions, from the isolated mountain kingdoms to the sprawling tent cities of nomadic tribes, Harad contained multitudes. And among these multitudes rose leaders whose names deserve to be remembered alongside those of more famous heroes and villains of the age, yet who have been largely forgotten by northern chroniclers who dismissed them as mere Haradrim warlords without acknowledging their complexity, brilliance, or tragic nobility. Consider the king known in Gondorian records only as the Golden, so called because he dressed in armor adorned with gold that blazed like a second sun beneath the desert sky. He ruled a kingdom in the southern reaches of Harad, where mountains rose from the sand and ancient cities perched upon plateaus accessible only by narrow, easily defended paths. His people had never been conquered, not by earlier empires, not by rival kingdoms, and certainly not by distant Gondor. When Gondorian merchants first arrived at his borders, the Golden King received them with courtesy befitting his station. He listened to their proposals for trade agreements, examined the goods they offered, and considered the terms they suggested. Then he politely declined, explaining that his kingdom was self-sufficient and had no need for northern goods or northern alliances. The merchants returned with soldiers. What followed was a conflict that lasted decades. Gondorian forces attempted repeatedly to penetrate the Mountain Kingdom, to establish outposts from which they could project power into the region. Each attempt was repulsed. The Golden King fought with a combination of tactical genius and intimate knowledge of terrain, using the mountains themselves as weapons. Gondorian armies would advance into valleys that suddenly became death traps when positioned forces triggered rock slides, or when flash floods roared down canyons without warning. But the Golden King was not merely a warrior. Records suggest he was also a philosopher, a scholar who studied the histories of other civilizations and drew lessons from their rises and falls. He understood that military resistance alone would not preserve his kingdom's independence indefinitely. Gondor was vast, populous, and possessed resources that dwarfed those available to any single Haradrim realm. Victory in battle after battle might delay the inevitable but could not prevent it. So he pursued a different strategy. He forged alliances with neighboring kingdoms, creating a defensive confederation bound by mutual interest in resisting northern expansion. He sent emissaries to Umbar, recognizing that the Corsairs' maritime power complemented the land-based strength of the desert kingdoms. And when darker powers offered assistance, he accepted, not eagerly, not as a supplicant, but as a pragmatist who understood that drowning men do not debate the purity of offered ropes. Yet this pragmatism came with costs that perhaps even he did not fully anticipate. The weapons provided by Mordor's agents were effective, certainly. The strategic advice offered by Sauron's emissaries proved valuable. But these gifts came with corruption attached like invisible poison. The Golden King's court, once known for its cultural sophistication and adherence to ancient codes of honor, gradually darkened. Advisors who counseled caution mysteriously died or disappeared. Rituals were introduced that older priests regarded with disquiet. The very armor the king wore, gold that had once symbolized the sun's glory, began to seem less brilliant and more like a gilded cage. Gondorian chronicles record the Golden King's final battle, a great engagement fought in a mountain pass where his forces attempted to halt a Gondorian army's advance. The battle raged for 3 days, neither side willing to yield ground. On the 3rd day, the Golden King led a cavalry charge personally, his gilded armor unmistakable even in the dust and chaos of combat. He fell pierced by 17 arrows, though he died only when a Gondorian knight drove a spear through the joints in his armor. Even then, witnesses reported, he refused to fall from his saddle until his own men could reach him and bear his body away. His last words, according to those who heard them, were not a curse against Gondor but a prophecy. "You have won nothing. My death changes nothing. The desert remembers, and what the desert remembers, it avenges." His kingdom fell within a generation, but the hatred he kindled endured. Then there was the priest king of the southern stars, so called because he claimed guidance from celestial omens and maintained a court of astronomers and oracle priests who interpreted the heavens' messages. His realm lay in regions where the desert gave way to somewhat more fertile lands, supporting cities of considerable size and sophistication. Unlike the Golden King, who resisted through military might, the Priest King employed subtler methods. He welcomed Gondorian ambassadors with elaborate ceremony, signed trade agreements, and even allowed the establishment of a Gondorian embassy within his capital. To all appearances, he had accepted Gondor's sphere of influence and sought merely to secure favorable terms within that reality. But beneath this cooperation ran currents of resistance invisible to Gondorian observers. The Priest King's astronomers did study the stars, but they also coordinated communications between scattered resistance groups across vast distances using signals and ciphers that Gondorian intelligence never penetrated. His oracle priests did conduct ceremonies, but those ceremonies also served to identify and train individuals suitable for infiltration into Gondorian-held territories. For years, the Priest King played a double game of exquisite complexity. He provided Gondor with intelligence about rival kingdoms, movements, intelligence that was accurate enough to be valuable, but carefully selected to serve his own strategic interests. He allowed Gondorian merchants to operate in his lands, while ensuring they remained dependent on local intermediaries who could manipulate prices and availability. He presented himself as a loyal ally, while quietly supporting the very forces Gondor was fighting. The deception was eventually discovered, though accounts differ regarding how. Some sources suggest a defector from the Priest King's court revealed the truth. Others claim Gondorian intelligence simply accumulated enough inconsistencies to recognize the pattern. Regardless, when the revelation came, Gondor's response was swift and brutal. An army arrived at the Priest King's capital with demands for his immediate surrender and the dismantling of his kingdom's autonomy. He refused. The siege that followed lasted months, with the Priest King's forces employing a defense as sophisticated as his earlier deceptions. But ultimately, superior Gondorian numbers and siegecraft prevailed. The Priest King himself was captured alive, a rarity in these conflicts. He was taken to Minas Tirith to stand trial for treachery, a spectacle meant to demonstrate Gondor's justice and authority. During his trial, he spoke only once, addressing not his judges but the assembled observers. "You name me traitor," he said, "but to betray, one must first hold loyalty, and I never swore faith to your crown. You call yourselves just, yet you sit in judgment over a sovereign king whose only crime was defending his people's freedom." History will remember this moment, though perhaps not as you imagine. When your white towers crumble and your banners are dust, when the very name of Gondor is forgotten, the stars will still shine above the desert, and my people will still remember that we resisted. He was executed the following dawn, but his prophecy haunted those who heard it, for in it rang a truth that Gondor's pride could not fully suppress. That from the perspective of those they conquered, the South Kingdom was not a beacon of civilization but an invading empire, and resistance to such invasion was not treachery but honor. There were others. The Serpent Lord himself, architect of the Great Unification. The Storm King who commanded the coastal regions and whose ships complemented Umbar's corsairs. The Silent Queen whose kingdom in the deep desert was said to be protected by sorceries even Gondor's wizards could not overcome. Each was a figure of power and complexity. Each had reasons for resistance that went beyond simple hatred, and each has been reduced in Northern chronicles to little more than a name or a title. Yet perhaps the most tragic of all was a king whose name has been preserved, though his deeds remain obscure. He was called Harumr in some texts, though whether this was a true name or a title is uncertain. What sets him apart is a single detail mentioned in a fragmentary account. He had once visited Gondor as a young man, had walked its streets and studied in its libraries, and had genuinely admired the civilization he saw there. But he had also witnessed how Gondor's might was wielded in the south. He had seen the contempt with which his people were treated, the casual cruelty of occupation, the assumption that southern cultures were primitive and in need of northern enlightenment. And he returned home changed, not to crude hatred, but to a more nuanced and therefore more dangerous understanding. When he eventually rose to power in his own kingdom, he fought Gondor not as a barbarian seeking plunder, but as a civilized man rejecting imperialism. He studied Gondorian military tactics and developed counters. He understood Gondorian politics and exploited its divisions. And when Mordor's emissaries arrived offering power, he saw them clearly for what they were, yet accepted their aid anyway, because he believed that even alliance with darkness was preferable to submission to an empire that viewed his entire civilization as lesser. "They call us evil," he reportedly said to his council, "because we refuse to be conquered. They name us servants of shadow because we fight for our freedom. Let them." Names are wind, but liberty is blood, and I will see my people bleed before I see them bow. He died in battle, like so many others, his kingdom eventually absorbed into Gondor's expanding dominion. But the questions he embodied never received answers. Were the wars in the south truly necessary? Could diplomacy have achieved what force could not? Did Gondor's expansion serve justice or merely ambition? These questions were uncomfortable, and so they were set aside, buried beneath the urgency of more immediate concerns. Yet they persisted, like ghosts haunting the margins of the official histories. And in the shadows, watching all of this unfold, the pride clashing with pride, the legitimate grievances twisted into weapons, the tragedy of peoples forced into alliances with darkness to resist what they perceived as a greater evil, Sauron's influence spread like venom through a wound. The Dark Lord needed not to control these kingdoms directly, merely to ensure that their hatred of Gondor burned hot enough to serve his purposes. One king in particular received a vision, or so the fragmentary account suggests. A dream that came night after night, showing him a shadowed gift arriving from the east, a promise of power sufficient to drive Gondor from southern lands forever. The accounts do not name this king, do not specify his realm, but they describe his growing obsession with this prophesied gift, his conviction that salvation for his people would arrive with it. What that gift proved to be would reshape the entire character of the Southern Wars and unleash horrors that neither side had anticipated. The corruption of Harad did not occur in a single dramatic moment, but through a process of gradual erosion, like water wearing away stones so slowly that the change is invisible until the structure collapses. Sauron's manipulation of the southern kingdoms represented perhaps his most sophisticated campaign of subversion, not the crude domination he would later employ with orcs and other servants, but a subtle orchestration of existing grievances, pride, and desperation into a symphony of service. His emissaries arrived at royal courts, draped in black, that seemed to absorb light rather than merely block it. They spoke in voices that witnesses struggled to describe. Some claimed the words bypassed their ears entirely, resonating directly in the mind. Others insisted the emissaries never spoke at all, that their messages were understood through some darker communion. Regardless of the mechanism, their messages found receptive audiences. To proud kings stinging from military defeats, they whispered of ancient weapons that could shatter Gondorian shield walls. To desperate rulers watching their people starve under economic blockades, they offered knowledge of dark fertility rituals that could coax crops from even the most barren soil, at costs that were not immediately apparent. To ambitious princes seeking to rise above their station, they promised power that would make rival claimants irrelevant. And they brought gifts. Swords that never dulled, armor that turned aside blows that should have been fatal, standards that inspired fierce courage in those who fought beneath them, and fierce terror in those who faced them. On the surface, these seemed merely superior craftsmanship, the products of techniques unknown in the South. Only later did the recipients discover the prices embedded in these gifts. The sword that never dulled also thirsted for blood and would turn upon its wielder if denied. The armor that protected also enslaved, making the wearer gradually dependent upon its power. The standard that inspired courage did so by feeding upon the very souls of those who rallied to it. But by the time these costs became apparent, rejection was no longer simple. Kings who had built their reputations upon victories won with gifted weapons could not easily set those weapons aside without appearing weak. Warriors who had bonded with ensorcelled armor found removing it brought physical anguish. And armies that had fought beneath Mordor's banners discovered that those who attempted to desert would sicken and die of no apparent cause. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Courts that had prized honor began to justify atrocities as military necessity. Cultures with rich traditions of poetry and philosophy grew harsh and militaristic. Religious practices that had celebrated life and light acquired elements of blood sacrifice and shadow worship. Those who objected, priests who warned against the corruption, advisors who counseled rejection of Mordor's gifts, common people who recognized the darkness creeping into their societies, found themselves marginalized, exiled, or simply disappeared. Gondorian intelligence observed these changes with growing alarm but limited understanding. Reports spoke of Haradrim armies displaying increased coordination and ferocity, of enemy soldiers who fought without fear of death, of casualties that should have broken morale, but instead seemed to strengthen enemy resolve. What the reports could not adequately convey was the metaphysical transformation occurring, the way entire cultures were being reshaped into weapons aimed at Gondor's heart. And then came the Mumakil. The war elephants of Harad had always existed, even before Sauron's influence reached the southern kingdoms. They were native to certain regions of the Haradwaith, immense creatures domesticated over generations for use in warfare and ceremonial purposes. But the traditional war elephants, while formidable, were fundamentally animals, powerful but possessing animal limitations, vulnerable to fire and loud noises, prone to panic if wounded or startled. The creatures that began appearing on battlefields were different. Larger than any elephants previously recorded, standing so tall that their backs were level with fortress walls. Their hides had thickened into natural armor that could turn aside arrows and even light spear thrusts. Their eyes held an intelligence, or perhaps cunning is the better word, that was distinctly unnatural. And their temperament had shifted from the manageable aggression of war beasts to something approaching malevolence. How this transformation was achieved, Gondorian scholars debated extensively. Some proposed selective breeding programs of unprecedented sophistication. Others suggested alchemical treatments that altered the creature's fundamental nature. The darkest theories proposed that these were not truly elephants at all, but something else wearing elephantine shape, spirits of malice given flesh through sorceries best left unexamined. Regardless of their origin, their impact on the Southern Wars was immediate and catastrophic. These creatures, these Mumakil, as the Haradrim called them, could shatter a shield wall by simply walking through it. They carried platforms on their backs that held dozens of archers, creating mobile fortifications that conventional tactics could not counter. And perhaps most terrifyingly, they seemed immune to the fear that conventional war elephants displayed. They would advance into pike formations without hesitation, accepting wounds that would have sent normal elephants fleeing, driven by something beyond animal instinct. The first recorded deployment of these enhanced Mumakil occurred at a battle whose name translates roughly as the breaking of shields. A Gondorian army had achieved what its commanders thought was an ideal defensive position: high ground with clear sight lines, flanks protected by terrain that would channel any attack into a killing ground. They watched a Haradrim force approach and noted with some satisfaction that the enemy would have to advance uphill through a narrow defile to engage, a maneuver that would cost them dearly. Then the first Mumak rounded the bend in the defile, and satisfaction turned to horror. The creature was as large as a moving fortress. Its tusks had been capped with bronze, extending their reach and adding cutting edges. The platform on its back held not just archers, but also siege weapons, small catapults that could launch stones or fire into the Gondorian formations. And behind it came others, a dozen of the beasts advancing in a line that filled the entire width of the defile. Gondorian archers loosed volley after volley, but arrows that struck the creatures, thick hides simply buried themselves without apparent effect. Spearmen braced for impact, but when the first Mumak reached the shield wall, it simply walked through it, crushing soldiers beneath feet the size of shields, sweeping others aside with its trunk, spearing still more on those terrible bronze-capped tusks. The creature's weight and momentum were unstoppable, and the disciplined formation that had held against cavalry charges and infantry assaults shattered like pottery dropped on stone. Behind the Mumakil came Haradrim infantry, pouring through the gaps the beasts had torn in Gondor's lines. What should have been a defensive victory turned into a rout. The Gondorian army broke, survivors fleeing in disorder while the great beasts pursued them, not with the blind panic flight chase that normal elephants might have engaged in, but with what appeared to be deliberate, methodical hunting. Fewer than a third of the Gondorian force survived to reach friendly territory. Those who did brought tales that their commanders initially dismissed as exaggeration born of trauma. Elephants the size of buildings. Creatures that seemed intelligent enough to coordinate with infantry. Beasts that appeared to feel no pain and fear nothing. Surely these were nightmare visions, not accurate reports. The second battle proved the reports were, if anything, understated. This time Gondorian command prepared specifically to counter the Mumakil. Fire was known to frighten normal elephants, so fire was prepared in abundance. Massive ballistae, artillery pieces designed to reduce fortifications, were positioned to target the creatures. The terrain was selected specifically to limit the Mumakil's mobility. They would have to cross boggy ground where their weight would be a disadvantage, not an asset. Every preparation proved insufficient. The Haradrim commanders revealed tactical sophistication that matched their enhanced war beasts. They did not simply charge the Mumakil at the Gondorian positions, but used them in coordination with other forces. Light cavalry drew out the Gondorian fire, absorbing the prepared traps and oil fire barriers. Infantry probes tested the defensive positions, identifying weak points. Only when the defenses had been degraded did the Mumakil advance, and they did so from unexpected directions, having maneuvered through terrain the Gondorians had thought impassable for creatures of such size. The ballista shots that found their marks did wound the beasts. One Mumak collapsed with a massive bolt driven entirely through its body. But the others came on regardless, and when they reached the Gondorian lines, the slaughter was worse than before because the defenders had committed all their anti-elephant resources and now had nothing left. This battle, too, ended in Gondorian defeat, and now fear spread through the South Kingdom's armies like disease. Soldiers who had faced orc hordes without breaking began to panic at reports that Mumakil were approaching. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline when even veteran troops were considering desertion rather than face the beasts. The The psychological impact of the war elephants exceeded even their tactical significance. Yet the Mumakil represented only the most visible manifestation of Mordor's influence. On a deeper level, Sauron's corruption was transforming the entire nature of the conflict. What had begun as a struggle over territory and sovereignty was devolving into something darker. A war where atrocity begat atrocity, where both sides increasingly abandoned ethical constraints in pursuit of victory, where the line between defender and aggressor blurred beneath layers of accumulated bitterness. Gondorian soldiers who had initially fought with some reluctance, viewing their southern enemies as fellow men led astray, began to see them as irredeemable servants of evil deserving no mercy. Haradrim warriors who had fought for their kingdoms, independents, found themselves increasingly serving goals they did not fully understand, wielding powers that frightened them, becoming the very monsters Gondor had always claimed they were. And over it all hung Sauron's shadow, not yet fully returned to power, but already exercising terrible influence. The Dark Lord needed not to control every Haradrim soldier or corrupt every southern king. He needed only to ensure the war continued, that Gondor's strength was bled away fighting in the south rather than being marshaled against Mordor itself. Every soldier who died in the desert was one fewer who might later stand at the Black Gate. Every resource expended pacifying Harad was one not available to fortify against assault from the east. The southern wars were, from Sauron's perspective, magnificently efficient. Two of his enemies were destroying each other, and all it cost him was some weapons, some dark knowledge, and some selective encouragement of existing hatreds. The corruption of Harad served his purposes beautifully, not because he valued the Haradrim or cared about their grievances, but because their conflict with Gondor weakened both sides. And the Mumakil, those engines of terror and destruction, would continue to haunt battlefields for ages to come, becoming symbols of an age when the Southern Wars reached their apex of horror. When soldiers who survived those conflicts grew old and told their stories to grandchildren, the moment they always returned to was the sight of those colossal silhouettes moving across desert horizons. The war elephants of Harad, enhanced by darkness, advancing with inexorable purpose while the very earth shook beneath their tread. One account, preserved in a veteran's memoir, captures the emotional impact with painful clarity. I had faced death before. I had stood in shield walls against cavalry charges, had weathered arrow storms, had fought in melees where men died screaming around me. But nothing prepared me for the moment when I looked across that valley and saw not one Mumek, but dozens, a moving wall of armored flesh and hatred. In that instant, I understood that we could not win. We were not fighting mere enemies, but fighting against something that had learned to weaponize nature itself. The Great Elephant Wars, as they came to be known in later chronicles, represented the southern conflict at its most terrible and spectacular. These were not battles in the conventional sense, but cataclysmic confrontations, where conventional military wisdom proved not merely inadequate but actively counterproductive, where courage and discipline that had won 1,000 previous engagements now meant only dying in formation rather than in panicked flight. Gondor's military doctrine, refined over centuries of warfare against various enemies, simply had no framework for countering the Mumakil effectively. Traditional pike formations, which could hold against cavalry by presenting an impenetrable hedge of points, collapsed when creatures weighing several tons simply walked through them, splintering the pikes and crushing the pikemen. Cavalry charges, which might scatter infantry or even break lesser war elephants through speed and shock, became suicide runs when directed at Mumakil, whose hides turned sword blows and whose tusks could kill a horse and rider with a single sweep. Yet Gondor could not simply avoid battle. The strategic situation demanded engagement. Key territories had to be defended, crucial supply routes protected. And so commanders were forced to develop new tactics through brutal trial and error, each failure measured in hundreds of casualties. One strategy that showed some promise involved targeting the Mumakil's legs. A creature of such size required massive, sturdy limbs to support its weight, and if those legs could be sufficiently damaged, even a Mumak would collapse. Specially trained units armed with axes and heavy blades were tasked with closing to melee range, essentially running beneath the beasts while avoiding their stomping feet and sweeping trunks, and hacking at the tendons and joints. The casualty rate among these units approached 90%. Most died in the attempt. Those who succeeded in crippling a Mumak often died anyway when the creature collapsed upon them. Yet some survived, and wounded Mumakil could indeed be brought down. But killing one required sacrificing dozens of soldiers, and the Haradrim had many of the beasts. The mathematics of attrition did not favor Gondor. Fire proved more effective than expected, though not in the way initially assumed. The Mumakil themselves seemed largely unafraid of flames, but the wooden platforms on their backs were vulnerable. Fire arrows aimed not at the creatures, but at their riders could turn the platforms into infernos, forcing the archers and siege weapon crews to abandon their positions or burn. A Mumak without its complement of ranged attackers was still dangerous, but far less devastating to Gondorian formations. This led to deployments of specialized fire arrow units, trained to maintain discipline under the terrifying sight of charging Mumakil and aim for the platforms rather than the creatures themselves. These units had to stand their ground closer and longer than any rational fear would allow, waiting until the beasts were near enough that fire arrows could reach the platforms with accuracy. Many broke and fled before reaching optimal range. Those who held achieved results but paid dearly. Haradrim commanders learned to screen the Mumakil with light cavalry specifically to hunt down these fire arrow units before they could do significant damage. Perhaps the most successful, though still horrifically costly, tactic involved targeting the handlers directly. Each Mumak was guided by expert drivers who sat at the base of the creatures' necks, using prods and verbal commands to direct the beast's movements. Kill the handler, and the Mumak would often become confused, its coordinated actions breaking down into random destruction that might harm its own side as much as the enemy. But reaching a Mumak's handler required getting past the protective infantry screen, surviving the arrow fire from the platform, and somehow climbing onto a creature that stood 4 times the height of a man, all while that creature was actively trying to kill you. Soldiers who accomplished this feat were celebrated as heroes, assuming they survived. Most did not. One battle in particular exemplifies both the horror and the heroism of the Great Elephant Wars. It took place in a broad river valley where Gondorian forces had established positions to prevent Haradrim armies from advancing northward into more valuable territories. The Gondorian commander, a veteran of decades of southern warfare, had chosen his ground carefully. The river would funnel any attack into predictable channels, and prepared defenses would maximize Gondor's advantages in discipline and heavy infantry. He had not anticipated that the Haradrim would bring 60 Mumakil. When scouts reported the approaching force, initial estimates suggested perhaps a dozen war elephants, a serious threat but manageable with the preparations in place. But as the Haradrim army deployed for battle, the true scale of their Mumak corps became apparent. They advanced in multiple lines, the ground shaking with each step, their trumpeting calls echoing off the valley walls like the horns of some apocalypse. The Gondorian commander faced a terrible choice: retreat and abandon critical territory, or stand and face odds that seemed insurmountable. He chose to stand, though accounts suggest he harbored no illusions about victory. His goal was simply to inflict sufficient casualties to make the Haradrim pay dearly for their advance. The battle that followed lasted from dawn until twilight and claimed more than 15,000 lives. Gondorian formations held with desperate courage, soldiers standing in ranks even as Mumakil literally walked through their lines. Fire arrow units burned several of the platform-mounted weapon positions, achieving local successes that prevented complete annihilation. Ballista crews worked their engines until the machines broke or the crews died, managing to kill or cripple nearly a dozen Mumakil at the cost of their own lives. But 60 Mumakil were too many. One by one, the Gondorian positions were overrun, formations broken, defenders scattered. By the time the sun set, painting the river red with reflected firelight from burning siege engines and dying campfires, Gondor's army had ceased to exist as a cohesive force. Survivors fled northward in small groups, harassed by Haradrim cavalry, dying in ditches and along roads as they attempted to reach safety. Yet the Haradrim had paid as well. Their infantry casualties numbered in the thousands. Nearly a fifth of their Mumak corps was dead or too wounded to continue fighting. And the victory, while tactically decisive, did not achieve the strategic breakthrough they had sought. Gondor would establish new defensive positions further north, and the war would grind on. This became the pattern of the Great Elephant Wars, battles of epic scale and horrific cost that achieved no lasting resolution. Gondor could not defeat Haradrim forces backed by Mumak corps without suffering crippling casualties. Harad could not capitalize on tactical victories because Gondor always managed to establish new lines of resistance, always found fresh troops to throw into defensive positions, always retained enough strength to make further advance prohibitively costly. The war was consuming both civilizations, bleeding them white, destroying not just armies but the societies that sustained them. Gondorian provinces in the south were depopulated, their young men dead in distant battles, their economies collapsed beneath the weight of military taxation. Haradrim kingdoms fared no better. Entire tribes had been destroyed, cities reduced to ruins, and the corruption from Mordor's influence spread like rot through cultural institutions that had stood for millennia. And still the Mumakil advanced, in battle after battle, across valleys and riverbanks and desert plains. Their trumpeting became the sound of an age dying, a world being consumed by wars that neither side could win, but neither dared to lose. One Gondorian general, in a letter to the steward written shortly before his death in battle, captured the despairing realization that was taking hold. "We fight not for victory has become impossible. We fight merely to ensure that, when we finally fall, We do so having inflicted sufficient pain upon our enemies that they, too, are broken beyond recovery. This is not war. It is mutual annihilation proceeding at the stately pace of military campaign seasons. He died 3 weeks later when a Mumak crushed the command post he was coordinating from. His letter survived, filed away in the steward's archives, a testament to the futility that had overtaken the Southern Wars. Yet even as the Great Elephant Wars raged, diplomatic channels remained partially open. Both sides understood, at some level, that the conflict was unsustainable. Gondor could not commit indefinitely to southern wars while Mordor's threat grew in the east. Harad could not continue losing entire generations to battles that gained temporary territory at best. Tentative communications began, feeling toward some possibility of peace, or at least of ceasefire. What emerged was not peace in any meaningful sense, but rather an exhausted stalemate that both sides dressed in diplomatic language to preserve the fiction of conclusion. The final Southern Compact was less a treaty than an acknowledgement of mutual exhaustion. After decades of grinding warfare, after countless battles that neither side could truly claim to have won, after the expenditure of resources that both kingdoms desperately needed for other purposes, Gondor and the major Haradrim powers negotiated a settlement that satisfied no one, but which all could at least accept as preferable to continued conflict. The terms reflected the complex military situation. Gondor would withdraw from its deepest southern holdings, acknowledging implicitly what had become obvious to all. It lacked the strength to maintain control over territories so distant from its core provinces. Fortresses that had cost thousands of lives to establish were simply abandoned, left to the desert sands and whatever forces chose to occupy them. Strategic outposts that had anchored Gondorian presence in the south were evacuated, their garrisons marching northward in columns that seemed less like withdrawals than funerals for imperial ambition. In exchange, Haradrim forces would cease their raids into Gondorian territory, and their kingdoms would enter into nominal peace agreements that included trade provisions and mutual recognition of sovereignty. The Haradrim would keep the territories they had retaken, though precisely defining borders in the shifting sands of desert regions proved nearly impossible. Some Haradrim kingdoms agreed to these terms eagerly, desperate for respite from wars that had devastated their populations. Others accepted only grudgingly, viewing the compact as a temporary pause rather than genuine resolution, and some refused entirely. Several Haradrim powers, particularly those most deeply corrupted by Mordor's influence, rejected the compact as betrayal. They had not fought for decades simply to accept negotiated settlement when Gondor was visibly weakening. They recognized that the South Kingdom's withdrawal was not generosity, but necessity, a sign that Gondor's strength was failing. Why negotiate peace when victory might still be achievable through continued pressure? These kingdoms continued their hostilities, though at reduced intensity. Raids persisted, though they came less frequently. Border skirmishes continued, though on smaller scales. And the Mumakil, though no longer deployed in corps of dozens, still occasionally appeared on battlefields where Gondorian forces attempted to hold defensive positions in the south. For Gondor, the compact represented both relief and humiliation. Relief because it freed troops and resources desperately needed elsewhere. Mordor's shadow was growing, and the East demanded attention. Humiliation because the greatest kingdom of men had been forced to acknowledge limits to its power, to retreat from territories it had once considered integral to its strategic position, to accept that there were conflicts it simply could not win. The withdrawal itself was a logistical nightmare and a continuing military operation. Fortresses had to be evacuated in good order, with garrisons marching north through territories where they remained vulnerable to attack. Civilian populations that had settled in the south under Gondorian protection now faced terrible choices: abandon homes and livelihoods to retreat north, or remain and hope for mercy from Haradrim forces that had little reason to show any. Many chose to flee, creating refugee columns that stretched for miles, desperately making for the new, more northerly borders while harassment from hostile forces turned the journey into running battle. Not all garrisons successfully withdrew. Some fortresses were besieged by Haradrim forces that rejected the compact, and relief columns could not be spared. These isolated positions fought to the end, knowing no help would come, choosing death over surrender. Their stories became the subject of tragic songs in later years. Brave men holding impossible positions out of duty and honor, buying time with their lives for others to escape, dying beneath foreign stars far from the homes they would never see again. The final Southern Compact also revealed the depths of divisions within Harad itself. Kingdoms that accepted peace found themselves condemned by those that did not as traitors to the Southern cause. Internal conflicts erupted between Haradrim factions, civil wars that in some cases proved as destructive as the wars against Gondor had been. Mordor's agents encouraged these divisions, recognizing that a fractured Harad served the Dark Lord's purposes better than a unified one would. Yet even among those Haradrim powers that accepted the compact, the peace was fragile and conditional. They had not forgiven Gondor for the invasions, the occupations, the generations spent under northern dominion. They had simply acknowledged that continued war served no purpose while both sides were exhausted. The hatred remained, nursed carefully, transmitted to new generations through stories of ancestors who had died resisting northern imperialism. A Haradrim priest king, in accepting the compact's terms, made a statement that was recorded by the Gondorian ambassador present. "We agree to this peace not because we have forgotten, but because we are patient. Stone remembers the carver's chisel. Sand remembers the footprints of invaders. And the blood that has soaked into this desert will cry out across centuries. This compact purchases time, nothing more. And when the white tower's flame dims as it must, for all flames eventually fail, we will remember. Our children will remember, and the debts written in blood will be collected." The ambassador reported this statement to his superiors in Minas Tirith. It was noted, filed, and ultimately changed nothing. Gondor needed the peace too desperately to let such threats prevent it. But those who read the report recognized it for what it was, not idle posturing, but prophecy. The Southern Wars were not ending, but merely entering a period of dormancy. The fundamental conflicts remained unresolved. Perhaps most tellingly, the compact included no provisions for reparations, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing by either side, no attempts at reconciliation beyond the bare minimum required for trade relations. Both kingdoms simply agreed to stop actively fighting, retained all their grievances intact, and turned their attention to other matters while maintaining watchful suspicion toward each other. For the soldiers who had fought in the Southern Wars, the compact brought bitter relief. They had survived conflicts that killed so many of their comrades, had endured horrors that would haunt their dreams for decades, had given years of their lives to campaigns that ultimately achieved nothing lasting. Now they could go home, those who still had homes to return to. But they carried with them the knowledge that their sacrifices had purchased only temporary respite, not genuine victory, and that some future generation would likely be called upon to fight the same battles against the same enemies for the same disputed territories. A Gondorian veteran, questioned years later about his experiences in the South, responded with words that captured the futility that defined the entire conflict. "We won battles and lost wars. We held ground and abandoned it. We fought bravely and achieved nothing lasting. I watched friends die for fortresses we would later evacuate without a fight. I killed men whose only crime was defending their homelands from what they saw as invaders. And when it was all done, when the compact was signed and we marched north, I looked back at the desert and wondered what it had all been for. I still wonder. And I still have no answer that satisfies." The final Southern Compact would hold, after a fashion, for many years. Trade would resume along certain routes. Diplomatic communications would continue at minimal levels. The borders would stabilize into something approximating lasting positions, though raids and skirmishes never entirely ceased. And both Gondor and Harad would tend their wounds, rebuild their strength, and prepare, consciously or unconsciously, for the day when the old hatreds would flare into renewed conflict. That day would come, though not in the way anyone anticipated. When Sauron finally revealed himself fully, when the War of the Ring erupted across Middle-earth, the Haradrim would march north again, not as free kingdoms pursuing their own interests, but as vassals of Mordor, their legitimate grievances against Gondor twisted into service of a dark power that cared nothing for their peoples or cultures, but viewed them merely as expendable weapons to be hurled against the West. The soldiers who fought at the Pelennor fields, who charged on their Mumakil across ground where so many had died before, were the inheritors of hatreds born in these forgotten wars. And the Gondorian defenders who faced them were fighting enemies their grandfathers had battled in conflicts that had never truly ended, only paused. But that is a story for different chronicles. For now, the final Southern Compact represented an ending of sorts, however unsatisfying, however incomplete. The Great Elephant Wars were over. The constant campaigning in the southern deserts would cease, and both civilizations could turn their attention to other threats, other conflicts, other struggles for survival in a Middle-earth that offered no shortage of dangers to face. The desert wind continued to blow across abandoned battlefields, shifting the sands that covered the bones of thousands who had died in wars most would forget. And buried beneath those shifting dunes, two banners lay side by side, one bearing Gondor's white tree, another displaying Harad's crimson serpent. Their stories had mingled in blood and would remain entangled across ages, awaiting the day when some scholar or storyteller would dig them up and ask the uncomfortable questions about what those wars had truly been for. We return now to where we began, to the silence of forgotten battlefields, to the crimson sands that have swallowed the evidence of conflicts most chronicles ignore, to the spaces between the grand stories where smaller, more painful truths reside. The wars between Gondor and Harad shaped Middle-earth in ways that the more famous conflicts sometimes overshadow. While songs celebrate the great battles against Mordor, while bards recount the heroism displayed at the Black Gate and upon the Pelennor fields, the Southern Wars remain largely unsung. Yet their influence persists, woven into the very fabric of later history. Consider what Gondor might have been had it not spent centuries bleeding itself white in southern campaigns. The resources consumed in those wars, the soldiers who died in desert sands, the wealth expended on expeditions that achieved only temporary gains, the strategic attention diverted from preparing defenses against Mordor. All of these were costs that weakened the South Kingdom when it could least afford weakness. When Sauron finally launched his assault during the War of the Ring, Gondor stood diminished from what it had been, and the Southern Wars bore significant responsibility for that diminishment. Yet to blame Gondor alone would be to misunderstand the tragedy. The Haradrim kingdoms, too, were scarred beyond recovery by these conflicts. Entire cultures were corrupted by Mordor's influence, proud civilizations reduced to vassalage to a power that viewed them with contempt. The legitimate resistance to northern imperialism was twisted into service of a dark lord whose victory would have meant enslavement for Harad as surely as it would have for Gondor. Both sides lost, in the end, though they lost in different ways. And what of the individuals? The soldiers on both sides who fought and died believing their causes just. The Gondorian infantryman who genuinely believed he was bringing civilization to barbarian lands, never understanding that the barbarians possessed civilizations older than his own. The Haradrim warrior defending his homeland from invasion, never realizing that his resistance was being manipulated by forces that cared nothing for his people's freedom. These individuals made choices based on the information available to them, served causes they believed righteous, and died without ever seeing the larger patterns that rendered their sacrifices tragically futile. There is no simple moral to this story, no clear villain or hero. Gondor's expansion into the south was motivated by strategic concerns and economic interests that, from the perspective of the South Kingdom's rulers, seemed entirely rational. Harad's resistance to that expansion was equally rational from their perspective, defending sovereignty against foreign encroachment. Sauron's manipulation of both sides served his interests, but did not create the underlying conflicts. He merely exploited tensions that already existed. Perhaps the only clear lesson is the cost of unresolved hatreds, of conflicts that continue generation after generation, because neither side can find the wisdom to break the cycle. Gondor and Harad were not natural enemies. They might have been trading partners, even allies against common threats. But pride meeting pride, empire colliding with defiance, created a spiral of violence that consumed both civilizations and ultimately served only the Dark Lord's purposes. The battlefields remain, buried beneath drifting sands, occasionally revealed when storms reshape the dunes. Travelers crossing the Haradwaith sometimes stumble upon rusted armor half buried in the sand, or find bones bleached white by the merciless sun, or discover the remains of fortresses whose names have been forgotten. These remnants prompt questions. Who fought here? Why did they fight? What did they die for? But the desert offers no answers, only silence. In Minas Tirith's archives, the records of these wars gather dust. Few scholars examine them. The events seem distant and irrelevant compared to more recent conflicts. The scrolls of the stewards remain filed away, their accounts of southern battles and southern defeats preserved, but unread, waiting for someone with the patience to sift through them and reconstruct the forgotten history they contain. And in the lands of Harad, stories are still told. though they have become myths now, mingling history with legend until the boundaries between them blur. Tales of the Golden King who died with 17 arrows in his body, but refused to fall. Accounts of the Priest King who defied Gondor's judges even as they condemned him. Songs about the war elephants and the warriors who rode them into battles that shook the earth. These stories preserve something that Gondorian chronicles miss: the perspective of those who fought not for empire but for survival, not for expansion but for the right to exist free from foreign domination. Both sets of stories, Gondor's and Harad's, are true, and both are incomplete. The full truth lies somewhere between them, in the space where both perspectives can coexist and be acknowledged. But finding that space requires letting go of certainties, admitting that our enemies had reasons for their enmity, recognizing that righteousness is rarely as absolute as we prefer to believe. The forgotten battles of Gondor against Harad ended not with clear resolution, but with exhausted stalemate. They faded into history not because they were resolved, but because both sides lacked the strength to continue. And perhaps that is the most tragic element of all. These wars did not even achieve the dubious dignity of decisive conclusion, but simply trailed off into an uneasy quiet that everyone knew was temporary. When the War of the Ring finally erupted, when Haradrim forces marched north as Mordor's allies, they carried with them the accumulated hatred of centuries. The Gondorian soldiers who faced them fought enemies their ancestors had battled, continuing conflicts that predated their births and would outlast their deaths. The cycle remained unbroken. And still, the desert wind blows across forgotten battlefields, shifting sands that cover bones and armor, erasing evidence that anyone fought there at all. Time claims all things eventually, even memory, even hatred, even the certainty that our causes were just and our enemies evil. In the end, we are left with questions rather than answers. Were the Southern Wars necessary? Could different choices by either side have prevented decades of bloodshed? Did the conflict serve any purpose beyond weakening both participants and serving Sauron's designs? History does not provide comfortable answers to such questions, only the stubborn facts of what occurred. Two banners lie beneath the sand, their colors long since bleached by the sun, their fabrics rotting into threads that will eventually become indistinguishable from the dust that surrounds them. The white tree of Gondor and the crimson serpent of Harad, symbols of proud civilizations that clashed with such terrible ferocity, now rest side by side as the desert slowly erases them both. Their stories have mingled in the sand, as the blood of their bearers mingled on countless battlefields. And perhaps, in that mingling, there is finally something approaching peace, not the peace of treaties or compacts, but the peace of shared mortality, the recognition that all human glory is temporary and all human conflicts, however fierce they seem in the moment, are ultimately rendered equal by the passage of ages. The wars are forgotten now, at least by most. The battles are unsung. The heroes and villains are buried beneath sands that care nothing for our judgments of their deeds. But the desert remembers, in its way. And when the wind shifts across those crimson dunes, when storms reshape the landscape and reveal what has long been hidden, the ghosts of those burning suns rise briefly before being buried once again. This was their story, incomplete, uncomfortable, refusing the easy certainties of clear heroes and obvious villains. This was the tale of the forgotten battles between Gondor and Harad, a tragedy without catharsis, a conflict without resolution, A war that served only to demonstrate that even the noblest civilizations can be brought low when pride will not yield and hatred cannot be set aside. May their mistakes teach us. May their sacrifices not be rendered entirely meaningless by our failure to learn from them. And may the sands that cover their bones eventually bring the peace that eluded them in life, the peace of being forgotten, released from history's judgment into the eternal silence of the desert. The story ends, as it began, with the wind and the sand and the silence. And beneath them all, the bones of thousands who fought and died in wars that most will never hear of, for causes that seemed righteous at the time but which history has revealed to be far more complex and far less certain than any participant understood. Remember them, if you will, or forget them, as the world already has. Either way, the desert continues its patient work of burial, covering evidence that these wars ever occurred, until someday, perhaps centuries from now, perhaps millennia, the last traces will finally vanish completely. And then, truly, the battles will be forgotten and the silence will be complete. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.